Film ratings are usually presented as simple guidance, just a tool to help parents decide what's appropriate for their kids. A PG-13 movie is for teens, an R movie is restricted, and NC-17 is adult only. But behind these labels is a system that is far less neutral than it appears. In this final episode of Rated and Restricted, we're zooming out to ask the bigger question that's been building across the series. Who does the rating system actually serve? Is it protecting parents and children, or is it shaped by studios, economics, and cultural bias? And in a media landscape that looks very different from when the system was created, does it still function the way it claims to? The ratings process is often described as uniform. Every film is submitted, viewed, and assigned a rating according to the same standards. In practice, however, the experience of going through that process can look very different depending on who made the movie. Because the Motion Picture Association is funded and governed by the major studios, companies like Warner Bros., Universal, and Walt Disney Studios are deeply familiar with how the rating system works. They have long-standing relationships with the ratings administration, legal teams who understand the appeal process, and the financial resources to re-edit and resubmit a film multiple times. If a studio receives an R when it wants a PG-13, it can make small adjustments, request clarification, and keep negotiating until it lands on the commercially desirable rating. Independent filmmakers rarely have that luxury. Submitting a film for rating costs money. Editing, re-exporting, and resubmitting costs more. Each appeal takes time, legal knowledge, and additional fees. For a small production without studio backing, an unfavorable rating can be final, not because the content cannot be changed, but because the filmmaker cannot afford to keep playing the game. This imbalance is highlighted in This Film Is Not Yet Rated, which shows how studio films are given specific guidance about what to cut or alter, while independent films often receive vague explanations like tone or context. Without clear feedback, it becomes nearly impossible for small filmmakers to know how to edit their work to satisfy the board. The result is a system where access, not just content, determines outcomes. Studio films are shaped through a collaborative back and forth with the ratings board, while independent films face a more rigid, opaque judgment. What appears to be a neutral ratings process becomes, in reality, another structural advantage for the industry's largest players, and another barrier for voices outside the studio system. A movie's rating is not just the label for parents. It is a gatekeeper for distribution, marketing, and profit. Long before audiences decide whether to buy a ticket, theaters, advertisers, and retailers look at the ratings to determine whether the film is even viable to carry. Most major theater chains in the United States are reluctant to book NC-17 films at all. An NC-17 rating often means fewer screens, limited showtimes, and in some cases, outright refusal to exhibit the movie. Retailers and television networks historically avoided advertising or selling NC-17 titles, and many newspapers once refused to run ads for them. Even today, streaming storefronts and digital marketplaces may bury these titles in search results or restrict promotional placement. The rating, then, becomes an economic filter. This dynamic is not accidental. It is built into the system created by the Motion Picture Association. Because the ratings are industry-issued rather than government-mandated, the consequences are enforced through market behavior. A restrictive rating quietly signals to exhibitors and advertisers that a film is risky business. The financial pressure this creates causes filmmakers to often cut or tone down content not for artistic reasons, but to avoid a rating that would cripple their release. In this way, the rating system shapes films before audiences ever see them. The difference between an R and a PG-13 can mean millions of dollars. A PG-13 film can be marketed to teenagers, shown in more theaters, and advertised widely. An R narrows the audience. An NC-17 can effectively erase it. For independent filmmakers, this can mean the difference between a national release and obscurity. For studios, it determines how aggressively they can promote a film and how large the opening weekend might be. What is framed as consumer information becomes, in practice, an economic lever, one that quietly pressures filmmakers to conform to the expectations of the ratings board in order to survive in the marketplace. A consistent criticism of the American rating system is its apparent double standard. Extreme violence often earns a lighter rating than honest depictions of sexuality. This pattern reveals not just how films are judged, but what cultural values are embedded in the system itself. Under the Motion Picture Association guidelines, prolonged or graphic violence can still fall within a PG-13 rating, while brief nudity or non-explicit sexual content frequently pushes a film into R territory. Superhero films like The Dark Knight or action franchises like The Hunger Games depict shootings, explosions, and death on a massive scale while remaining accessible to teenagers. Meanwhile, films that center on intimacy or sexual identity, even when handled thoughtfully, face far stricter scrutiny. This imbalance is a major focus of This Film Is Not Yet Rated. The documentary shows how scenes involving female pleasure or LGBTQ sexuality are more likely to trigger an NC-17 rating than scenes of brutal violence. The documentary argues that the ratings board reflects a distinctly American discomfort with sex, especially non-heteronormative sex, while treating violence as a more acceptable form of entertainment. This stands in sharp contrast to many other countries. In parts of Europe, such as France and Germany, films with nudity or sexual content often receive ratings equivalent to a US PG-13, while graphic violence is more heavily restricted. The cultural logic is inverted. Sexuality is seen as a natural part of life, while violence is considered more psychologically harmful to young viewers. Blue is the Warmest Color was rated 12 in France, while receiving an NC-17 rating in the United States for its explicit sexual content. American films that are rated R or NC-17 for sexual content frequently receive more lenient classifications overseas. This discrepancy highlights how ratings are not purely about protecting children, but about enforcing cultural norms. In the US, the system implicitly teaches that bodies and intimacy are more dangerous to young people than guns or explosions. The result is a ratings culture that shapes filmmaking itself. Directors learn that they can show a city being destroyed, but must be cautious about showing two people in bed. Violence becomes marketable, while sexuality becomes controversial, not because of universal standards, but because of specifically American ones. Even though the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors of America and the Hays Code officially ended in the late 1960s, its influence never fully disappeared. Instead, it evolved, transforming from a strict set of written do-nots into a more flexible but still powerful system of expectations that continues to shape American cinema today through the Motion Picture Association rating structure. The original Hays Code dictated what could and could not be shown on screen, limits on sexuality, violence, morality, and even the idea that wrongdoing could not be depicted without punishment. Modern ratings no longer enforce morality in such an explicit way, but the underlying logic still lingers. Films are still filtered through assumptions about what audiences, especially younger audiences, should be protected from, and those assumptions often echo older cultural anxieties. This legacy is visible in how filmmakers anticipate the ratings board's decisions before they even submit their work. Directors frequently self-censor, trimming sexual content, softening language, or adjusting tone to avoid an R or NC-17 rating. In that sense, control has not disappeared, it has been internalized. Instead of a code enforced by direct prohibition, filmmakers now work within a system of predicted consequences. At the same time, the industry has adapted to these constraints so thoroughly that they often feel invisible. Big-budget franchises, especially those produced by companies like Warner Bros. Or Walt Disney Studios, are carefully engineered to fit within PG-13 boundaries, maximizing audience reach while avoiding controversy. The system has become less about overt restriction and more about optimization, how to tell stories that remain commercially viable within accepted limits. In this way, the legacy of the Hays Code is not a single set of rules, but a mindset, the idea that film content must be shaped in response to institutional standards of acceptability. Even without formal censorship, those standards continue to guide what gets made, how it is told, and what is left out. If there's one genre that consistently exposes the contradictions of the rating system, it is documentary filmmaking. Documentaries often deal with real-world issues, sexuality, violence, politics, and social critique, which means they frequently collide with the standards of the Motion Picture Association. But what makes documentaries especially revealing is not just what they show, but how inconsistently they are treated. Many documentary filmmakers report that their films are rated more harshly than narrative films containing similar or even more extreme content. Scenes of sexual education, LGBTQ identity, or systemic violence can trigger stricter ratings than fictionalized violence in mainstream entertainment. The result is a pattern where documentaries are sometimes punished for realism, while fiction is granted more leniency for stylization. For example, Bully initially received an R rating largely due to its language, despite its educational focus on real-life school bullying. This tension is at the center of This Film Is Not Yet Rated, in which the director turns the camera back on the rating system itself. The film argues that documentaries are particularly threatening to the board because they do not allow for the same contextual distancing that fiction does. A scripted film can frame violence as fantasy or genre convention, but a documentary presents real bodies, real events, and real consequences. One of the most controversial aspects revealed in the documentary is how the ratings board applies its standards unevenly even within nonfiction films. According to filmmakers interviewed in the film, edits that satisfy the board are sometimes less about removing explicit material and more about softening political or sexual perspectives. This creates the perception that ratings are not just about content, but about comfort. What kinds of realities are considered acceptable for mainstream audiences? Because documentaries often operate with smaller budgets and limited distribution channels, an unfavorable rating can be especially damaging. Unlike major studio films, they cannot easily resubmit multiple cuts or absorb the financial risk of an NC-17 or overly restrictive R rating. This makes documentary filmmakers more vulnerable to the subjective decisions of an anonymous board. In this way, documentary controversies reveal a deeper issue. The rating system does not just classify films, it influences which realities are easiest to distribute, monetize, and ultimately see. When you step outside the United States, it quickly becomes clear that film ratings are not universal. They are cultural systems shaped by different national priorities. What is considered appropriate for teenagers in one country may be restricted for adults in another, revealing just how subjective the American system really is. In the U.S., the Motion Picture Association emphasizes parental guidance and industry self-regulation. But in many other countries, ratings are handled by government agencies or independent public boards with different cultural standards. For example, in the United Kingdom, the British Board of Film Classification tends to focus on contextual harm, meaning violence, drug use, and sexual content are evaluated based on how they are presented, not just whether they appear. This difference becomes especially clear in comparisons between the US and parts of Europe. In countries like France, films with nudity or sexual content are often rated more leniently than in America, reflecting a cultural view that sexuality is a normal part of life rather than something inherently harmful. Meanwhile, graphic violence may receive stricter classifications depending on intensity and realism. In contrast, the American system often does the opposite. U.S. ratings tend to be more permissive towards violence while being stricter towards sexual content, especially anything that is explicit, non-heteronormative, or centered on female desire. This creates a noticeable gap between American ratings and international ones for the same film. For example, many Hollywood films rated PG-13 or R in the United States are classified differently abroad. A film might receive a relatively moderate rating in Europe while being more restricted in America due to sexual content, or conversely, receive stricter ratings overseas if violence is more graphic or prolonged. These differences reveal an important truth. Ratings are not objective measurements of harm. They are reflections of cultural values. What one society considers acceptable for teenagers, another may restrict entirely, and vice versa. The American system, in particular, reflects a cultural tendency to normalize violence in media while treating sexuality as something more dangerous or controversial. Ultimately, comparing systems around the world makes the U.S. rating structure feel less like a universal standard and more like one cultural interpretation among many. For decades, the rating system created by the Motion Picture Association functioned as a gatekeeper for theatrical film distribution. An R or PG-13 rating could determine where a movie played, how it was advertised, and whether audiences could even access it. But the rise of streaming has fundamentally disrupted that control. Platforms like Netflix, Amazon Prime Video, and Disney Plus do not rely on theatrical distribution in the same way, which means they are not bound by the same economic pressures tied to ratings. While many streaming services still display MPA ratings for consistency and parental guidance, those ratings no longer determine whether a film could be released or widely seen. Instead, streaming platforms use their own systems, content warnings, maturity labels, and increasingly personalized parental controls. A film or series can be immediately available worldwide regardless of its rating category, which weakens the traditional consequences of an NC-17 or even an R designation. In practice, accessibility is now determined more by algorithms and subscription access than by rating boards. However, this does not mean ratings have become irrelevant. Instead, their authority has fragmented. For parents, ratings are now one tool among many, alongside platform-specific controls and curated profiles. For studios and creators, ratings still matter for marketing, international distribution, and awards eligibility, but they are no longer the sole determinant of success. Interestingly, streaming has also introduced a paradox. While access has expanded, so has content saturation. With millions of titles available, ratings are often overshadowed by thumbnails, recommendations, and algorithms that decide what gets seen first. In this sense, the role once played by ratings, guiding audience choice, is now partially taken over by technology companies rather than classification boards. The streaming era has not eliminated the rating system, but it has stripped away much of its enforcement power. What remains is a symbol of guidance rather than a mechanism of control, signaling a broader shift from regulated gatekeeping to algorithm-driven visibility. One of the most overlooked problems in the modern rating system is something critics sometimes call ratings drift. The idea that the meaning of a rating changes over time, even though the label itself stays the same. The system created by the Motion Picture Association was originally designed to be flexible. Unlike the old Hays Code, which laid out strict rules about what could and could not be shown, the rating system was intentionally vague. There is no fixed rubric that says exactly what qualifies as PG, PG-13, or R. Instead, ratings are meant to reflect the standards of contemporary parents. In theory, this flexibility allows the system to evolve with society. As cultural norms shift, so too can what is considered appropriate for children. But in practice, this creates a serious inconsistency problem, especially over time. The system only truly works when viewers are consuming films within the same cultural moment in which those ratings were assigned. That assumption began to break down with the rise of home viewing. When movies were primarily experienced in theaters, audiences mostly encountered new releases, all rated under current standards. But with the advent of home video, cable television, and eventually streaming libraries, viewers suddenly had access to decades of films at once. The problem is that the MPA does not re-rate older films. A PG film from the 1970s exists forever under its original classification, even if modern PG standards have shifted significantly. This creates confusion for parents. A film labeled PG before the creation of the PG-13 category in 1984 may contain content that today would almost certainly earn a PG-13 or even an R rating. Films like early blockbuster-era releases often include violence, language, or thematic material that feels inconsistent with what modern audiences expect from family-friendly viewing. Yet the label remains frozen in time. The invention of PG-13 itself highlights how much the system has changed. Before 1984, there was a large gap between PG and R, which led to public concern that some PG films were too intense for younger viewers. PG-13 was introduced as a compromise category, but it also reset expectations. After its creation, the PG label gradually became softer, and the kinds of films allowed into it became more restrictive in terms of intensity. As a result, many films that would have been PG in earlier decades would now likely be PG-13. Such appeal takes time. Today, the overwhelming majority of mainstream kids or family films are rated PG, while the G rating has become increasingly rare. G is now often reserved for very young children's animation or educational content, meaning that even mild thematic complexity or conflict tends to push a film into PG territory. This shift reflects not just changing standards, but also market pressure. Studios know that PG is more commercially flexible, while G can be seen as too limiting or too childish for broad audiences. The result is a system where labels remain static, but meaning constantly shifts underneath them. Parents may assume that a rating like PG has a consistent definition across time, but in reality, it functions more like a snapshot of cultural standards at the moment the film was released. Without clear rules or periodic re-evaluation, the system gradually accumulates contradictions. Older films that feel harsher than their rating suggests, and newer films that stretch category boundaries in the opposite direction. In the end, ratings drift exposes a fundamental flaw in the design of the system. A flexible framework only works when its audience exists in the same present tense. Once the viewing public spans decades of content at once, flexibility turns into inconsistency, and guidance becomes harder to trust. The central justification for the entire film rating system created by the Motion Picture Association is simple: protect children from inappropriate content. On paper, the system seems straightforward. PG-13 warns parents about material that may not be suitable for younger viewers, R restricts minors without an adult, and NC-17 signals content intended strictly for adults. But the deeper question is whether those labels actually achieve their intended purpose. In practice, ratings are not enforced by law. Parents ultimately decide what their children watch, and theaters rely on voluntary compliance rather than legal restriction. That means the system functions more as guidance than protection. A child can still access almost any film with parental permission, streaming access, or even inconsistent enforcement in theaters. Another issue is that ratings are broad categories applied to highly complex content. A single PG-13 label might include a lighthearted teen comedy or a film with intense war sequences and emotional trauma. Without context, parents may assume a level of safety or severity that does not reflect the actual experience of the film. At the same time, defenders of the system argue that ratings are not meant to be perfect predictors of harm. Instead, they are designed as a communication tool, one piece of information among many that helps parents make informed choices. In that sense, ratings may succeed not by enforcing protection, but by encouraging parental engagement. Still, the system's effectiveness depends heavily on awareness and trust. If parents misunderstand ratings, ignore them, or assume they are stricter than they are, the protective function weakens. And if filmmakers and audiences see ratings as inconsistent or biased, the credibility of the entire system is undermined. Ultimately, the question is not just whether ratings can protect children in theory, but whether they do so reliably in a media landscape that is increasingly complex, global, and difficult to regulate. Across this series, the rating system has looked less like a fixed set of rules and more like a shifting reflection of industry power, cultural values, and historical assumptions about audiences. From its internal structure to its real-world economic impact, it's clear the system does more than simply guide viewers. It helps shape the entire film landscape. So as we reach the end of Rated and Restricted, the final question isn't just whether ratings are useful. It's what they've become, and whether a system built decades ago can still serve the world of media we have today. Thank you for watching, and for coming along on this journey through film history, censorship, and culture.